Good evening. My name is Eric Eickhoff, and I serve as the Associate Director for Alumni Relations at John Carroll University. Thank you for joining us this evening for our next installment of the John Carroll University Alumni Author Series. The Alumni Author Series was launched in November 2020 as a way to highlight those who've written books, articles, poems, screenplay, and other written works within the JCU alumni community. Tonight, we are joined by Laura DeMarco, a member of the JCU class of 1995. Laura will speak about her newest book, Lost Civil War, The Disappearing Legacy of America's Greatest Conflict. We chose to feature her book tonight as we honor and recognize the anniversary of both the start of the Battle of Gettysburg and the conclusion of the Battle of Vicksburg. Before I introduce Laura, I'd like to provide you with some tips for tonight's program. Please make sure you're muted throughout the duration of our program. We will take questions at the end. If you have any question, you may either type it into the chat and I will ask her on your behalf, or at the conclusion of Laura's presentation, use the raise hand feature and we will allow you to ask your question. It is now my honor to introduce Laura DeMarco. Laura DeMarco is an author of the books Lost Cleveland, Cleveland Then and Now, Mark Twain's America Then and Now, and the new Lost Civil War. She's an arts and culture writer in Cleveland, Ohio. Laura specializes in history, lost landmarks, and literature. She also writes about the historical preservation, architecture, art, film, and travel. She lectures at museums, schools, colleges, and historical societies on these topics and much more. She's been awarded a commendation from the Council of the City of Cleveland in March 2018 for her commitment to the preservation and reporting on historical landmarks. Her book, Lost Cleveland, was one of 20 titles named a State Library of Ohio Choose to Read book for 2019-2020. She has a degree from John Carroll University in English literature. Laura, thank you for joining us this evening. The floor is yours.
Just a little bit about me. Why am I talking about the Civil War? I told you I was an English literature major. Well, for the last 20 years, up until last year, I was a journalist also, in addition to being an author. I worked at the Plain Dealer for 20 years, and I got started writing about history. I'm just going to, admit somebody else here. There we go. I got started writing about local history, Cleveland history, because I'm a third generation Clevelander. I bet some of you are Clevelanders too. John Carroll draws a lot from the Cleveland area. And about 5 years ago, I was writing a history series called Lost Cleveland. I wanted to write more than what could just be in a newspaper article. I wanted to write a book. And I reached out to a company called Pavilion Books. They're based in London in the UK. Just on a whim, because I saw that they had published books about the architectural heritage and history of some other American cities. They're mostly bigger cities, Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, Chicago, and I did a lot of European cities too. And I said, Cleveland has so much history. How about a book on that? And to my great surprise, they got back within one day to say, yes, we actually have heard a lot about Cleveland over here in the UK. And it was partly because this was 2016 and LeBron was still with the Cavs. So I think that's one reason they had heard so much about Cleveland. But anyway, long story short, it led to this book, Lost Cleveland. And to their surprise and my surprise, it turned out to be a really great seller for them. And even though it was competing with all these books about, international cities like Berlin and Paris and so on. But then I got tired of writing about things that were all gone, that was all lost landmarks, buildings that were torn down, neighborhoods that were lost. And that led to a book called Cleveland Then and Now, which is, if you're interested in Cleveland history, tells about transformed places. Like you might know the West Side Market or Playhouse Square, places like that tell the history of our city. And that book also did well for them. And that led, combined with my English degree from John Carroll, to my third book. And don't worry, I'm getting to the Civil War. That book was Mark Twain's America Then and Now. And that book traced the journey of Mark Twain, arguably the most important American writer. It traced his life's journey through the geographic journey of his life, just traveling around the country, which included a couple of very important stops in Cleveland. He launched some world tours here. But also it touched on Mark Twain's role in the Civil War, which really sort of was the most problematic of his life. If you know Mark Twain, he was born a Southerner. He had family members who had slaves, although he did not, his family did not. They were very poor and they were against slavery, his immediate family. But he didn't participate in the Civil War. He didn't choose a side. He didn't fight for either side. He fled to the West. That's when he was in the West doing his roughing it years. So I touched on the Civil War in that book, and that sort of led eventually to this book now, which is not to do with Mark Twain, but it is to do with the Civil War, and just how it is the most important, obviously, event in American history, and it touches every aspect of our lives, and maybe more so now in 2020 and 2021 than it has in a long time. Now, if you've been watching all the news lately, you of course seen all the talk about the monuments which are being torn down in the South. This book is not about that, although I do touch on it. Those monuments, as you probably know, were mostly not Civil War era monuments. They were put up in the Jim Crow era to intimidate Black Americans. But when I mentioned I took a book about lost Civil War, people say, no, you're talking about the monuments. No, that's not it. This is about the real heritage that's being lost. And I'm just going to start to share my screen here a little bit. Okay, just give me a second. Hard to multitask. Can everybody see my screen now?
We're good to go.
Okay. So this book is about the real heritage that's being lost. And it's not being lost because it's being torn down out of protests or political reasons. Most Civil War heritage in America is being lost purely out of neglect and development. As you know, most of it is around Washington, D.C., Richmond. Those areas are incredibly densely populated, expensive areas, and history is really being paved over quite literally in those areas. So that's, I'm talking about the hospitals that were lost, the neighborhoods that were lost, the battlefield, cemeteries that were lost, just all sorts of things that we no longer have today. And many people didn't even know they ever existed. You can drive down the highways in the South and not realize you're driving over battlefields, such as in the Shenandoah Valley, where you drive over 8 battlefields as you drive there. So this is the cover of the book, as you can see, a nice picture of some colorized soldiers here. There we go. So the subtitle is The Enduring Legacy of America's Greatest Conflict. And this is about, how things are lost, but also how their legacy lives on. I just told you all this stuff. I should add that thanks to my father, who was not a John Carroll graduate, but he was a Xavier graduate, my love of history was really inspired by him. And we spent many, many childhood vacations on Civil War and other American history trips. Now that I'm an adult, I appreciate those much more, getting up, all piling into the family station wagon at 5 a.m. for the elaborately planned vacation, which I kind of do to my family now. And the book, in fact, is dedicated to my parents, who are both deceased. So that's just a little bit about my history interest. As I mentioned, the book includes lost battlefields, encampments, prisons, signal towers, hospitals, cycloramas, and lost photos, because photos are so important to the Civil War. And I'm gonna show you some photos of all of these things tonight. And I think I want to start talking a little bit about photos, because photos tell the story of the war. And this book has more than 200 vintage photos. If you are history buffs, any of you, you can do your own. I did a lot of research in historical societies, libraries, and so on. The Library of Congress, which is online, is a great resource that you can look up a lot of these photos yourself at as well. And during COVID, it was an excellent resource. This is just a kind of a whimsical, interesting photo here, and one you may not have seen a lot. It's a military balloon from the Battle of Fair Oaks in Virginia in 1862. And this is one of the first photos in the book. Why are photos so important to the Civil War? I'm going to start talking about those, and then we're going to get to some of these other different types of sites. And as Eric said, if you have questions, put them in the chat, raise your hand. We'd love to make this interactive, especially at the end. We're going to leave time for Q&A. Photos were so important because the Civil War was really the first war that Americans saw with their own eyes. There were some photos of the Mexican-American War and the Mexican-American War, and there are many paintings of the Revolutionary War, but those paintings were glorious. They painted generals and scenes that were dramatic and patriotic and so on. Photography brought the Civil War, the real war, into people's homes. Much like how TV brought the Vietnam War into people's, living rooms every day, the Civil War brought photography, brought the war into people's homes, and they saw that it wasn't all glorious generals fighting. It was brutal. It was real. It was deadly. It was something that touched every American family for the most part, whether you had a brother or a son or a husband who was fighting in the war, it touched you. And one of the most important examples of Civil War photography was the show that photographer Matthew Brady put together in 1862 in New York. People had seen pictures in newspapers and galleries and so on, but this show, The Dead of Antietam, featured photos by several photographers. And as you can see there, this is by Alexander Gardner, the photos were brutal and shocking, and they showed dead men who were boys, really, dead horses, former enslaved Americans picking up bodies from the ground. And this was a real wake-up call to Americans. They saw the grim toll of battle. And it was also a turning point in photographic history, because now this new medium was recognized as something that could connect people with things that were going on in a much more rapid way than paintings. But not all of the photos of the Civil War were of battles and were gruesome. Photography, as you know, at the time was a very cumbersome process. You didn't just run out with your camera or your iPhone. You had a whole wagon. And so, photographers traveled with assistants, whole crews and whole wagons. And for this reason, there are not many, in fact, there are almost no battlefield action photos. The photos are, as you saw with Antietam, after the fact, showing the toll, or they are posed camp sites, or candid camp pictures, but ones that took some setup time, not during the time of battle. For example, there's this photo in which Matthew Brady inserts himself of Union General R.B. Potter in an encampment. So as you can see, this is a very staged photo, but it still shows people what it was like there. And there were 2 million men fighting for the Union and close to 1 million Confederate volunteers. So all Americans really had a connection to the war, or most. But this brought a connection, this brought it home, a daily connection to them. And in addition to Matthew Brady, other photographers included Timothy O'Sullivan and George Barnard, as well as many unknown shooters. A lot of the photos, for example, you see from Matthew Brady, the most famous Civil War photographer, are actually not from him. They're from someone in his studio. So, these photographic records were sort of one inspiration for this book, because there was so much there to tell. So it helped tell the story so well. So, I began digging into archives, and we're going to look at some of those coming up now. And as the book took shape, we divided it into, originally it was going to be just battlefields, but we realized there was so much more lost history. So we divided it into some of those other categories that you saw earlier. And ultimately, I hope that this book and these photos provide a record of these noteworthy losses, that are being, as I mentioned, being paved over for suburban developments and so on. And I would like now to just step back a little. We've talked about photos and their importance, and I think we could just take a little tour through time talking about some of these topics that we touched on earlier. I will tell you one positive note before we start, however. In recent years, there has been a new preservation movement going on, in part inspired by Ken Burns' documentary. All those people who watched that years ago are now in places of power, and they're realizing how important it is to preserve this heritage, which is, I think, because of changing times, as well as a lot of activism in the Civil War and American history field. So what I'm showing you is going to show you now are places that are lost, but hopefully there won't be so many more places added, to this list, thanks to groups such as the Civil War Battlefield Trust. So let us begin on our journey. Oh, here's just one more picture of a photographer. You can see the wagon there. So you can see how over to your right, the photographer's over by the horse. You can see kind of how you had to take a lot of equipment with you. It was not an easy process. And here's one more photo actually before we start our tour. This is became a very famous photo of Cold Harbor, and this is where we're going to start. This is a picture of African-American soldiers, possibly escaped enslaved people, which were referred to by the unfortunate name of contraband, or possibly free Black Americans who were working with the Army. And they're collecting the remains of federal soldiers at Cold Harbor, which was one of the Union Army's greatest defeats. So this is the battlefield we're going to begin our tour with. Cold Harbor was the site of General Ulysses S. Grant's most brutal defeat, and he always regretted that. He said, "I have regretted the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. No advantage whatever was gained to compensate for the heavy loss we sustained." They were greatly outnumbered. There was about 62,000 Confederate Army there, and they suffered just 5,000 casualties. I'm sorry, even though the federal troops outnumbered them, they had more than 100,000. They weren't prepared. Their casualties were greatly outnumbered, with 12,000 injured or killed. And sadly, this site of Ulysses S. Grant's great defeat has been mostly paved over in development. It's in Virginia. It's suburban development now. The battlefield covered more than 7,500 acres, and right after the war, it became private land and farms. But eventually, people obviously sell their private land for development. There are some earthworks still there, about 300 acres that include a little bit of earthworks and a visitor center, but the vast majority of those 7,500 acres are paved over. So it's really tragic to think about it. Look at this sign of death here, that it's mostly all gone, except for a few hundred acres. Another thing I talk about in the book is encampments and forts. And right now we're looking at Brandy Station in Virginia. This was abandoned in 1864. It was best known as the grounds of the largest cavalry battle in the Civil War, which was in June 9th, 1863, where more than 20,000 cavalrymen met outside of Culpeper County in Northern Virginia. It was an inconclusive battle, however. After that, this area went on to become home to one of the largest long-term encampments of the Civil War. Most of the men lived in little pup tents, nothing like this. This is an example of an officer's quarters. And as you can see, some of the officers could even have their family there. They were very permanent buildings. And it was established as an encampment because it was located very close to an Orange and Alexandria depot. So it was a perfect place to spend the winter. And in fact, before the federal troops set up here, General Robert E. Lee had intended to spend there until he was defeated at Rappahannock Station. So the rebels withdrew in November of that year. And the very next morning, George Meade and his Army of the Potomac set up camp there. And there was 100,000 federal troops that hunkered down there for the winter. As I mentioned, most of the men were in tents, or some of the lucky ones were in primitive wood huts. They had blankets, but it was very brutal. It was a hard winter. Officers got these nice cabins. Horses just grazed wherever, and there was weaponry parked all over the countryside. There is one interesting remnant of this encampment, which is mostly gone, and it's known as the Graffiti House. Perhaps some of you have visited there. This house was a Confederate hospital during the Battle of Brandy Station, but it then became a headquarters for federal troops. And both of these troops left their graffiti there in lead pencils and charcoal. So they're really sort of this house, which exists still, is really sort of the only record left of this encampment. There are a few letters that you can see if you go to that house. For example, there's a very touching one here. Second Lieutenant Matthew S. Austin of the 5th New Jersey wrote a letter home to his father that Christmas. And he said, "Yesterday passed quietly enough so far as the 5th was concerned. A number of men received boxes from their homes enclosing good things for the season. I dined on chicken cooked in Orange, New Jersey, and sent on the 21st. The day was cold and freezing." So you can see if you go there, there are these touching remnants, but for the most part, it is completely built over, and there's no record of these, which were at the time permanent structures. Next, we're going to talk about what I think is one of the most interesting forts of the Civil War, Fort St. Philip in Louisiana. Not many photos exist of this, but there is this one painting that I found at the Library of Congress. Fort Jackson and Fort Phillips were both near New Orleans. And this is a painting belonging to Admiral Porter. Fort St. Philip was abandoned after the war, eventually damaged by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, but it has a fascinating history. I'm going to go to the next picture while I talk a little bit more about the history. This is what it looks like today. This fort actually goes back to 1792 when it was founded by the Spanish. And the Louisiana fort was eventually ruled by the Spanish, the French, and the United States. And not only did it become a Civil War fort, following the war, almost 100 years later, it played a role in the civil rights movement and a cult lived there. So I think this is a fascinating historical remnant. It's 40 miles north of the Mississippi and 80 miles south of New Orleans. It was built as Fort San Felipe by the Spanish rulers of Louisiana. And when it became part of America, it was expanded up until 1810. It was called into action in the War of 1812 in a 10-day siege, but it saw a lot more action in the Civil War, as did its sister fort, Fort Jackson. It was seized by the Confederates in 1861, seen as strategically important to protecting New Orleans, and it remained under their control until April of 1862, when it was under bombardment by the Union ships on the Mississippi. That April 24th, a passageway opened up, and the rebels surrendered on April 28th, and the city fell on May 1st. Not surprisingly, the fort was abandoned after the war and decommissioned in 1920. But this is where I think its history, in this case, actually gets more interesting. It was used as a tanning factory in the 1930s, but in the 1960s, it had sort of an awful episode where a segregationist leader named Leander Perez threatened to use this fort to lock up civil rights activists in 1964. And he even surrounded the fort with barbed wire. It was not used for that, fortunately. And even perhaps more strangely, a decade later, it became home to something called the Vela Ashby Intentional Spiritual Community, also known as the Christos family. About 20 followers of this cult lived there from 1978 to 1989, when their leader committed suicide at the fort and their devotees dispersed. Since then, it has been neglected. Most of the structures were damaged by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And today you can only get there by helicopter, as these photographers apparently did. But I find it fascinating that that these remnants still exist on this unavailable island in the Mississippi there. So this is, I think, the fascinating history of Fort St. Philip. That was one of my favorite things to write about for the book. Next, we are going to go back to the first Battle of Bull Run, Dudley Church. Perhaps you have heard of it. This is a building, a historic building that had a fascinating history in the Civil War and both battles of Bull Run. Its history sort of really begins July 21st, 1861. There were no services in this beautiful church this day, but it certainly wasn't quiet around Manassas, Virginia. Union troops streamed past the chapel on their way to attack the Confederate army on their left flank in what would be the first major battle of the war. The church would soon be put to use not as a sanctuary, but as a hospital. Immediately was converted into a hospital by General Irvin McDowell and Assistant Surgeon D.L. Magruder. And as you know, there were massive casualties in that battle. And the church eventually was really surrounded by bodies. It was a very messy battle. The troops were inexperienced. It was the first major battle of the war. There were about 3,000 casualties, including 481 killed. Most of the Union casualties were were brought to Dudley Church. They ended up placing men all around the property. When the Union retreated a few hours later, the men were left to be captured by the Confederates. A few Union surgeons did stay behind. Confederate surgeons tried to help the wounded, but many of them died. They had gunshot wounds, which became infected. Although it was battle scarred, the church again was put to use as a hospital in the Second Battle of Bull Run, August 28th to 30th, 1862. That fighting lasted 3 days, and there were a lot more casualties than the first one. It was one of the most significant Confederate victories of the war for General Robert E. Lee, as the Union was driven from Eastern Virginia and suffered about 15,000 casualties to the Confederates' 8,000. The church, however, also became a casualty of war. It suffered extensive damage and was razed. Eventually, a new Dudley Church, however, was built on the foundation. This church burned in 1918 after being struck by lightning. There is, however, a newer church built in 1922, so it's 99 years old, it's newer. And I think that's kind of an inspirational thing to know that a church lives on, a Dudley Church lives on. But this building saw so much history in the war only to become a casualty itself. Oops, trying to get my screen to go. There we go. Eric and I were talking earlier about things, what I thought was maybe the biggest losses of the war. I don't think prisons are the biggest losses of the war because they were so horrible, but I do think more needs to be said about Civil War prisons. What you're looking at right now is Andersonville Prison, where more than 12,000 men died, Union men. You might know that of the Civil War, a huge percentage of men died in Civil War prison camps. There were 150 Civil War prison camps, and none was more infamous than Andersonville. It was in Macon County, Georgia, and it opened in February 1864, and it held 45,000 Union soldiers until the end of the war. At one point in August of that year, there were 33,000 prisoners confined in that 1 month. And as this photo says, more than 12,000 men died here. You can see how they're crowded together. They died for all sorts of reasons, mostly starvation and lack of sanitation. However, there was almost no water in this camp. There was just a little tributary that flowed through the camp. It was filled with excrement. It was really terrible, but the people had nothing to drink, so they drank that and they got sick. The Confederate Army barely had enough food for their own prisoners, their own soldiers, so they really didn't save anything for these prisoners, who began to become emaciated. You may have seen some of the pictures of soldiers from Andersonville who look like walking skeletons. I do have one of those in the book, but I wanted to show what the camp looked like tonight. These prisons were really terrible. And I don't think enough attention is paid to that. And the Union Army wasn't exempt from treating prisoners badly. There are examples of Union prisons where Confederate prisoners were treated very badly as well. People died of typhoid. And at Andersonville, people also died from factional fighting, because these groups, sort of gangs of soldiers would band together to try, survival of the fittest. And there was a lot of fighting and so on going on. And this prison was not liberated until the end of the war. Although, as General William Tecumseh Sherman marched closer, prisoners were sent to other camps in the South. Its infamy was so bad that its commander, Captain Henry Wirz, was charged with war crimes. There are some very famous photos of him being hanged at the old Capitol Prison. Only one of 2 men convicted and executed for war crimes in the Civil War. The site was purchased. This site of so many deaths was purchased by the Grand Army of the Republic in 1890. In 1910, the land was donated to the federal government, and it's today, it does hold a National Prisoner of War Museum, which includes a reconstruction of the stockade. And the graves of many of those thousands of soldiers are still there. So just a little, remembrance should be paid to them, and that's very powerful. Next, we are going to Washington, where I also found this story really fascinating to write about and research. The Washington Arsenal in Washington, D.C., of course, which closed in 1881. As you know, the Capitol was never really attacked. There was the civil defenses around it, 68 forts. But there were losses of life in the Capitol during the Civil War. And one of the largest single-day losses of life in the nation's capital came not through warfare, but through a tragic accident at this building. On June 17th, 1864, 21 young women and girls were killed when a massive explosion erupted at the arsenal, where they were making rifle cartridges to support the war. Many of them, the majority of them, were Irish American women, first and second generation immigrants. They were patriotic, but they were also working to support themselves. Many of them were barely out of childhood, and they had, husbands and brothers off fighting in the war. And all of the arsenals, made great use of women, especially very young women and children, to do their work. On that day, the factory had 108 women on the factory floor, and there were some flares that were left in the sun to dry, and they ignited, leading to a massive explosion when it reached the gunpowder that the women were using. And many of those trapped burned to death because of their large hoop skirts. This tragedy was so greatly felt in America, although little known, I believe, at this time, that the War Department paid for the funerals and President Lincoln attended the funerals as well. It was just, unfortunately, one of many tragedies at that arsenal. The arsenals obviously are dangerous places. The first arsenal on that site was blown up by British soldiers in the War of 1812, and it was rebuilt. The next decade saw a new arsenal with many more buildings, and the military hospital opened on that site in 1857. By the time those women were working at it in the Civil War, it was a very large arsenal, the largest and most modern in America. And at one point it had 1,000 workers at its peak. By the year after the war, however, they weren't all needed, and there was only 150 workers there, mostly veterans. But the post-war years were not boring there. Its penitentiary was used to house the conspirators in President Lincoln's assassination. And in fact, their trial was held at the arsenal on July 7th, 1865. 4 were hanged at the grounds. There were some more tragedies there later, some more explosions, and eventually this arsenal was closed by 1881. Although the land remained part of the federal government and became a barracks for training officers. Since 1948, it has been the Leslie J. McNair Army Post, named after a World War II commander. Very nicely, there's a monument to the 21 young women killed in the Civil War, not too far away at Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. So there's a little bit of interesting women and immigrant history about the Civil War. That's one thing I really tried to do in this book is we all know the Civil War, we all should, from our history books and so on, but there's so many more stories there, that we didn't learn in school that are, if you do a little digging, are right out there, such as this one here about the Sanitary Commission. This is the Sanitary Commission Home Lodge for invalid soldiers in Washington, D.C., which closed in 1865. The Sanitary Commission was a privately run relief agency tending to soldiers on the battlefield during and after fighting. And it really was a godsend. It closed a huge care gap in the war that really caught everyone on all sides unprepared for the massive casualties. The USSC, as it was called, was founded with the goal of providing sanitary inspections and assistance, nursing assistance, and medical supplies to Union Army camps and hospitals. And it had some really impressive founders. They included Unitarian minister Henry Whitney Bellows, renowned landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, famed New York lawyer George Templeton Strong. So it had a lot of powerful people at the top. But it was conceived of by a group of women, the New York Infirmary for Women, and had hundreds of female volunteers. They began their mission by raising funds and purchasing and donating food and medical supplies. This was all privately funded. Their mandate grew quickly after their founding, and they created 30 soldiers' homes across America for disabled and discharged men from the Union, including homes in Memphis, Louisville, Nashville, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Cairo, Illinois. The most homes were centered around the Washington, D.C. area, including this home lodge at 347 North Capitol Street. And the central office was on F Street. And these were so important at the time because the American government was just not set up, nor was our healthcare system, to deal with so many invalided soldiers and physically and mentally. So this was very important. And this lodge in particular had 300 beds. And you could stay there if you were disabled, you needed rest, or you were in transit. Some people stayed a night, some people stayed long-term. There's a lot of documents that still exist from this, if you're interested in reading more about it, at the Library of Congress. After the war, people began to be moved to other homes. Although at one point, this home lodge had more than 8,000 individuals received. So it really did have a lot of people there. But by the end of the war, their mission was complete and the group ceased to exist on July 4th, 1865. By that point, all of the soldiers had been sent, hopefully to their home, but also in many cases to care facilities closer to their home. We talked about Gettysburg a little bit earlier. So this ties into the anniversary we are celebrating today. Well, not celebrating, but the anniversary we are acknowledging today, as well as the last topic we were talking about, healthcare. One of the most significant things about Gettysburg, beyond the obvious, is this Camp Letterman, Pennsylvania, was really the first place in America where battlefield medicine was practiced. The importance of this camp hospital in medical history really can't be underestimated. And it was founded there on the battlefield, basically, because there were just so many injured men at Gettysburg that the private and provisional hospitals around Gettysburg couldn't handle all of the people, all of the deadly and injured men who were coming to them. It was on George Wolfe's farm east of the fighting, located near the York Pike and the train depot. So men who were triaged could be sent on trains to other hospitals. This new tent hospital was named after the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, Dr. Jonathan Letterman, who's known as the father of battlefield medicine. And it opened July 22nd, so after the battle. It was the first major hospital in American history located not at a faraway city or barracks, and had hundreds of tents that were set up as the wards. At one point, it was home to more than 4,000 convalescing men. These were men who were so injured they couldn't be transported. A nurse called them, quote, the very dregs of battles from the two armies. The number of amputations that took place at this hospital numbered in the hundreds, unfortunately. Camp Letterman was also known for being the first hospital to have a large female nursing staff, approximately 40, who were sent from the Sanitary Commission. After the battlefield had cleared, many hundreds of men stayed behind in the hospital after the armies moved on. Eventually, by January of 1864, the hospital was closed. The men were shipped away, and for nearly a century, the significance of this area was underappreciated as development paved over Wolfe's farm. This entire area where Camp Letterman was has been taken over by sprawl. There's even a mobile home park on the site. And I think perhaps most sadly is the historical marker to it sits near Sheetz gas station number 326. So if you go to Gettysburg, look for the gas station and you should see the marker near there. Just going to talk about a couple more places and then we can move on to some questions. The USS Monitor. Talking about ships in the Civil War is an important thing to do. Of course, battles did take place on water. And the USS Monitor, which sank in 1862, so early in the war, might be the most important ship of the war, despite sinking off of Cape Hatteras on New Year's Eve. Its innovative design set the blueprint for warships for decades to come and was praised by no less than Winston Churchill. It was designed by a Swedish-American engineer, John Ericsson, and it was built in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. It was the first iron-hulled, steam-powered warship commissioned by the U.S. Navy. And it was commissioned as an answer to news that the Confederates were building their ironclad warship, the CSS Virginia. President Lincoln himself urged the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, to push for this ship. Ericsson's design was met with skepticism at first, but eventually approved by the Navy and commissioned on February 25th, 1862. And by March 8th, it had been towed to Virginia and was ready to fight with 49 men, including 10 officers on board. Inside, despite its great functionality, it also had some flair. The officers slept in private cabins and they had oriental rugs and formal furniture, while the others slept just bunked in goatskin mats. And it was put to use the very next day at a Union blockade on the James River. The CSS Virginia was moving through on a rampage, and what happened became known as the Battle of the Ironclads. This lasted 4 hours. And although this ended in a stalemate, it's considered the most important naval battle in Civil War history. And it really reshaped aquatic warfare for the future. Both ships were hit several times, though neither were seriously damaged. The Monitor didn't fight much after that. It was briefly used in the Battle of Drury's Bluff in May. And in September of 1862, it was sent to the Washington Naval Yard for repairs. Bad weather delayed its departure back to the south until December 31st. Many in the crew thought that because of her heavy weight, she should not go into open sea. She was not ideal for that, especially in inclement weather. And unfortunately, their misgivings proved right. A storm struck off of Cape Hatteras, and despite heroic efforts to seal the leaks, the Monitor went down 16 miles off the coast with 16 crew and 4 officers on board, and the wreckage still sits on the ocean floor. Just going to briefly talk about cycloramas, which is something that's sort of totally been lost since the Civil War. Cycloramas, like the one you're looking at Gettysburg here, or this is the outside of it. And then here's a picture of the Atlanta cyclorama. Existed before the Civil War. They were really sort of proto movies, sort of 3D paintings with images in front. And they were set up in a circular fashion to create a very immersive experience representing great events in history. So along with photos, cycloramas were one way that people in America became exposed to the Civil War. And they were hugely popular in telling the story of the Civil War. But despite their great popularity, only 2 still exist. And this includes the famous Gettysburg cyclorama on display at Gettysburg National Park. And that one, there were actually 4 versions of that painted. It is just 2 of the 4 are left. You could still go visit that, and as well as the Atlanta one, which we're looking at now. So cycloramas are kind of lost to time, but if you're going to Gettysburg, definitely worth seeing that, along with Camp Letterman and the other sites. And I just want to briefly talk about monuments. I said this book is not about monuments, nor is this talk, but you can't talk about the Civil War in 2021 without talking about the monuments. In particular, this soon to be removed Robert E. Lee monument. You know, there had been movement since the 1960s to remove most of these statues, part of the civil rights movement, as I mentioned earlier, and as I'm sure you all know, they were mostly put up in the Jim Crow era. And this movement really took off again, you know, in around 2016, but much more powerfully last year with the murder of George Floyd. Protests took place across the United States, and so many monuments were taken down across the South. Even monuments in places that you might not have known had honors to the rebels, including the Washington National Cathedral, which removed stained glass windows of Lee and Jackson. Also, Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, removed a monument to Robert E. Lee from its Gothic chapel. You know, just throughout the South, and even not just the South, monuments were taken down. This is slightly different, but a Confederate memorial was removed from George's Island in Boston Harbor. And this memorial was actually a cenotaph honoring Confederate prisoners of war who had died there, but that was still taken down. But as this movement was taking place across the country last year, this monument right here, the Robert E. Lee one, remained standing as developments took place in the court system. And just earlier this month, the Virginia Supreme Court has finally said that this can be removed and taken to an undisclosed location. It has not been done so yet. And I just want to leave you with a few words from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who weighed in on this. They said, although Confederate monuments are sometimes designated as historic, and while many were erected more than a century ago, the National Trust supports the removal from our public spaces when they continue to serve the purpose for which many were built. While some have suggested that removal may result in erasing history, we believe that removal may be necessary to achieve the greater good of ensuring racial justice and equality. And So that is the Historic Preservation's thoughts on the removal of these monuments. And again, this is a small part of the book here, but I didn't want to talk today without talking on this topic that's in the news even up until a few weeks ago when this monument made its way to the Virginia Supreme Court. But as we discussed, there's so much more lost Civil War history, and you know, we drive over it, we on highways, we go to Sheetz gas stations near it, and so on. So I hope that, you know, through these pictures and this book and this talk that you know, I've done a little part to kind of inspire people to sort of take a look at the history that's all around us. Not so much in Cleveland where I live, although there is history here, but you know, everywhere that we all live in America. So thank you for taking this little tour with me. If anybody has any questions or comments, I would love to discuss them. Should I stop sharing my screen, Eric?
Yep, go right ahead.
Okay.
So while Laura's taking down her screen, I encourage you all to start thinking some questions. If you have any, either use chat or you can, you know, raise your hand or unmute yourself. I did have one question for Laura that yeah, I'm always interested in, because there's so many aspects of the Civil War that we just don't know about. If there was one thing that you could bring back that you feel is so important that we should know more about, what would you bring back so that everyone else could know more about it?
You know, I think I do think that the medical aspect of it, like the Camp Letterman that I was talking about, is sort of understudied. I mean, I do think that would be important to pay more attention to. Just we talk about the battlefields a lot, but the hospitals, there was a lot of really famous hospitals and you know, nursing developments that went on during the Civil War. I think also you know, just even like, for example, I live in Cleveland, which you live too, Eric. You know, we had a camp here called Camp Cleveland, which has just recently been gotten more attention to it. You know, and every city really in America, or you know, most cities like in the North and South, not so much the far West, but you know, there is local Civil War history because there were all these camps set up, you know, for the people to train and muster. And so I think maybe the local aspect of it too, you know, like I don't live near Richmond, Virginia, but there's Civil War history near me. You know, I think is a very interesting thing for people to sort of look around in their own cities to see that. But if anything, it's just the photography, you know, just to go back to that. I mean, the importance of photography in the Civil War really, you know, can't be underestimated.
Yeah, you're completely right. It really is the first time that Americans got a real sense of what war was. You know, there's stories out there of, oh, we're going to go take a picnic out to watch the battle, and then all of a sudden, the people who are picnicking out there, they run away because of what the battle turned into. I don't think we
Bull
really
Run
realized
is
what it was going to be.
Famous example of that. People from Washington went out to Bull Run. They thought it'd be a lark, you know.
Yep.
And because you saw these paintings before, these Napoleonic paintings that were so glorious, right, and valor and so on. So I think, you know, this photography, like the Dead at Antietam, just really brought that home to people.
Yep, that makes complete sense. So Rachel asks, what do you find most fascinating about Civil War battlefields?
Well, I think in the context of the book, I find most fascinating is that, I mean, basically most of the South, right? Most of Virginia was a battlefield, like it's at some point, right? And the fact that just like there's so many, and you know, we know Vicksburg and you know the big ones, right? But just to know how many there were when little skirmishes took place and so on, and really like so many highways go over them. I find that fascinating in the South, like, you know, just like I mentioned earlier, the Shenandoah Valley, I think that highway goes over eight battlefields. You know, and most of them were on private land at the time, or, you know, public land. So they just sort of went back to nature, went back to the owners.
Yeah, I know there's one called Monocacy. And if you're going down 95 from DC down to Richmond, it bisects the battlefield. And, you know, I used to take that road quite a bit because I used to live in Virginia
Mhm.
and had no idea there was a battlefield on either side of the highway that I was driving on almost on a monthly basis. Paul asks, are some of the lost sites actually not permanently lost, but do we have opportunities to restore or preserve them in some other way?
Yes, Paul, that's a great question. We do. As I mentioned before, there's a real movement going on to preserve lately. As a lot of it is the American Battlefield Trust, the Civil War Battlefield Trust. These groups are great nonprofits, constantly raising money to preserve battlefields and acreage. You can look up their websites, as well as if you're on LinkedIn, for example, they both share a lot on there, and they both even do like videos and so on. So there's definitely time to save a lot of this stuff. And let me bring up one example actually of recent preservation, if I can find it here real quick. So where is that? Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time here. But there's many examples of recent preservation, especially in some of the lesser known battlefields. So I suggest following those groups. I know like right around Father's Day, they were doing like campaigns to raise money and so on. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done still.
Great. Thank you. Rachel has another question. She wants to talk a little bit more about Cleveland and how much did the Civil War affect the city of Cleveland? I don't know if you know about that at all, but if you do, it'd be interesting to hear.
Yeah, so Ohio overall had the second most number of casualties in the North. So Ohio was very important in the Civil War. I think there was about 30,000 deaths of Ohioans. And there were 5 camps in the city of Cleveland where men, mustered and trained, and then they marched to the train depot. The largest of those, Camp Cleveland, just recently got a historical marker. That's down in the Tremont area. If you're a Clevelander, you can look up the exact location online. That took up close to 40 acres, that camp. And that was also notable because it also included a hospital where people came back after the war as well to that hospital. So that's Cleveland's biggest, connection to the war. I mean, there's a couple others. President Lincoln's funeral train, came through here. But it was a very, we sacrificed a lot in this area for sure.
I'm actually reading a book. So I had told Laura, my family and I had just come back from a road trip, and we actually went to a number of battlefields, and it kind of inspired me because I didn't really realize how much of Ohio's men went to fight more in the Western theater as opposed to the Eastern theater, where you hear about Gettysburg and Antietam and whatnot. And there's a really good book that I'm reading. It's called Touched with Fire, and it's about generals that we've all heard of that went to become presidents: Garfield and McKinley and Grant and Hayes, and blanking on one more. But it's a pretty interesting book, especially locally because of Garfield being the Cleveland. Yeah,
president. That's actually great. I should have mentioned that. We have so many generals and important men from Ohio. I mean, William Tecumseh Sherman, also, right? I mean, Ohio, we really led that war, right? We did for the North. Yeah. I did find that example. I wanted to bring it up. Near Gettysburg, the Civil War Trust recently purchased in 2015 the 4-acre property on the Chambersburg Pike that held Robert E. Lee's headquarters there. So that was something that was endangered. It was actually being used as like a motel with a swimming pool and stuff around it. So they purchased that. So that, I mean, that may not have been preserved because it's in the North, but it's a Southern thing, but it's still an important, part of history. So that's definitely a recent example. They said that they called it the most unprotected, historically important building left from the Civil War at that time. So again, that was the Civil War Trust, and they're a really great group to look up if you're interested in supporting Civil War history.
That's definitely good that they saved that.
Yeah.
Regardless of who he fought for, it's important that piece of history is saved for certain. I want to ask, if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or hold on. Chris, I'm going to unmute you.
Hey, Laura.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, I got a question about your pictures. You probably went through hundreds, maybe thousands of pictures. How did you whittle it down to the 200 pictures that you had in your book?
A lot of work. It was very hard. Well, I had help with that, fortunately, the publisher and the design department at Pavilion Books, but it was certainly hard because there are so many. So what I tried to do is to approach it via topic. So like, come up with like, say, Gettysburg, for example, and then Gettysburg had a lot of pictures, but you know what I mean? Like I went by topics, which ones best represented that topic, rather than like choosing 5,000 photos and then forcing the topics onto the pictures, if that makes sense. But it was certainly hard because there's so many pictures. And what's remarkable about that is, it's called Lost Civil War, and many of these photos were almost lost. Like Alexander Gardner and some of these others, for example, they tried to give their photos to Congress. Congress didn't even want them at first. It was years after the war when they were would like be allowed to donate them. Like people didn't necessarily see the value of these photos as much as we do now. I mean, there was a house in Washington, D.C. where boxes of Civil War photos were found.
Wow.
Just randomly placed there. They don't know how they got there. So I just tried to like approach it by topic and just kind of narrow it down. And there's certain ones you have to include, like the execution of Henry Wurz, or some of these Matthew Brady photos, or Antietam, for example. But then there's some others that were kind of surprising. And then there were other places like, Fort St. Philip, where it was important to include the forts, but there weren't really photos of it too.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
You asked about sites or things that I think were important or should be talked about more. Another one is Chambersburg, the only northern city to burn. And I don't know if a lot of people even know about that. It was burned in retaliation for a lot of the burning that the Union was doing. There was merciless warfare going on both sides, and total warfare. And the city of Chambersburg was burned in retaliation for that, not far from Gettysburg, the only northern city.
Yeah, it is interesting to see what people pick up and are taught, and what people aren't taught, right?
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna let Mike ask a question. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yeah. In addition to Chambersburg, the Carlisle barracks were also burned just north of Gettysburg. I was just there, so there's a lot of history in that area.
Oh my God, yeah.
And I just posted a comment. I saw your Sheet Station. I bought gas there.
Did you? Okay.
I stayed at the Hampton Inn right across the.
Did you see the historical marker?
I did. It's overgrown with weeds, but it's there.
Yeah.
And they're talking about doing something, but it is commercial.
Yeah.
And I am a member of the American Battlefield Trust, and I was involved in the fundraising for the Lee's headquarters.
Oh, okay, great.
It's just beautiful now. It's unbelievable what the before and after is. Incredible.
Well, that's great. Feel free to share anything about the group in the chat, or people can just go on the website, right, and find out more.
It's just
about it.
battlefields.org, and you'll be overwhelmed. In fact, today and tomorrow and Sunday, Saturday and Sunday, the American Battlefield Trust has a series of YouTube presentations on day 1, day 2, day 3 of that battle,
Great.
as does the Adams County Historical Society. You could spend all day today, as I have, just watching Gettysburg YouTube videos.
Oh, that's great. I'm going to check that out tomorrow. I guess I missed today.
Well, you can still find them. Just go to YouTube.
Oh, they're not live. Okay, they're just yeah. Okay, great.
They're on live Facebook, but they're recorded on YouTube as well.
Thank you. Thanks, for
Mike.
sharing that.
Any other thoughts or questions for Laura? All right. Well, Laura, thank you again so much for taking time out of your evening to share this, I think, really important and unique part of our history that's been lost, but hopefully we can regain some of it. We are incredibly grateful that that you did that. We're incredibly grateful that you're part of our alumni community. So thank you again for being with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Eric and John Carroll. And thank you. It's a beautiful summer evening, and I so appreciate everybody else taking their time to come talk Civil War and listen to Civil War. And I truly mean that. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Well, before we say goodnight, I wanted to let you all know of a few other opportunities that you have to engage with our alums and the university throughout the summer months and into the fall. So as things are starting to open up, we're going to be starting to have a combination of both in-person and virtual and some hybrid programs as well. Our first in-person program in about 18 months outside of a reunion is actually going to be on Thursday, July 15th, and our Cleveland Alumni chapter will host an Alumni and Friends social at Trestle Brewing Company in the near west side of Cleveland, which is actually owned by Ryan Bennett, who is a John Carroll University alumnus. For those who prefer virtual programming, we'll still have a variety of programs, including our JCU Alumni Continuing Education Series programs, and we're going to focus on St. Ignatius, as this summer marks the 500th anniversary of his conversion and the Battle of Pamplona. We'll also have an Italian wine and cooking demonstration and another program focusing on the Ohio and Erie Canal and Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Finally, we're working on putting the finishing touches on our JCU Junior program for children for JCU alumni and friends of the university. This year's topics include mythology, hands-on science, space exploration, and vaccines. You can find more information about and register for all of these upcoming programs and events at jcu.edu/alumni. Additionally, we invite you to view recordings of all previous programs on the JCU Alumni Association YouTube channel. To view our extensive library, search JCU Alumni on YouTube. And then finally, please consider a charitable gift to John Carroll in support of our students, our faculty, and our entire campus community. If you already made a gift this year, thank you for your generosity. If you have not, please consider joining me in supporting JCU so that we can continue to deliver an outstanding education for our current and future Blue Streaks. You can make a donation by visiting jcu.edu/give. Thank you again for joining us. Take care, be well, stay safe, and onward on, John Carroll.